Hi, today we'll talk about a concept known by some groups of Asian Brazilian people, especially those who have family roots from East Asian regions such as Japan, China, and Korea. So, we're talking about the model minority myth. Have you ever had that Japanese friend who was seen by everybody, including your teachers, as the best student in your class? Or another friend who you would call Asian because besides being very good at maths, this person was also very kind, sweet, and quiet. Sometimes this person might know martial arts or eating with chopsticks every day, and of course, speaking a foreign language fluently. Well, if you had at least one of these experiences in your life, being Asian or not, you probably know a little bit about the concept we are trying to present today. But before we go through this concept, let's have an overview on these words. Because, when we find a word we don't know, probably we Google it, right? Well, we already did this for you at etymonline.com. So let's see. Model minority myth. A concept made by 3 words. First, model. A model is a word from Latin modulus, a small measure standard, but its meaning as a standard for imitation or comparison, thing or person that serves or may serve as a pattern or type is from the 1630s. Second, minority. Minority comes from minor with different ancient roots such as Latin minor, less, lesser, smaller, junior, but specifically the idea as the smaller division of any whole number of persons. The meaning, group of people separated from the rest of a community by race, religion, language, etc., is from 1919, originally in an Eastern European context. And third, myth. This one is probably the most figurative of all. From French mythe and directly from modern Latin mythos and Greek mythos, speech, thought, word, discourse, conversation, story, saga, tale, myth, anything delivered by word of mouth. And the general idea of untrue story, rumor, imaginary or fictitious object or individual. So now we have the composition model minority myth, where each word has a meaning, but together and placed in a context turned out to be very different from our isolated ideas of model, minority, or myth. The model minority myth is a concept rooted in American history as a narrative promoted by Asian communities who wanted to assimilate themselves into mainstream society through moral values and patriotism. However, this narrative was used in different ways throughout history. Well, let's go back in time. In the US, oppression over Asian people began in the mid-19th century when conflicts in China created a huge influx of Chinese immigrants towards the American West Coast. They settled in that region, but economic recession made these people be seen as a threat by white Americans. Going through an association with the Orient, mysterious and dangerous, these stereotypes came up quickly as we see the Chinese Exclusion Acts in the end of the century. During World War II, the notion of model minority started to change to a positive picture of Asian Americans. In the geopolitical field, the US had just reestablished relations with China against Imperial Japan. We see this narrative as a tool to attract support from Asia even more after the end of the war. In a moment when the African-American freedom movements were in progress, the concept of model minority came up to silence racial injustice against Afro-Americans. In this context, Asian immigrant people became the perfect contrast to black people. Though these Asian Americans were not perceived as white Americans, their status and social mobility isolated them from black communities. The article written by sociologist William Patterson for the New York Times was a perfect description of this case. The success of Japanese workers, which had Confucian values, work ethic, centrality of family, and genetic superiority, was the content under the title Success Story. After the description of Japanese, the Chinese were also described at the U.S. News and World Report as, at a time when it's being proposed that hundreds of billions be spent to uplift Negroes and other minorities, the nation's 300,000 Chinese Americans are moving ahead on their own with no help from anyone. If we try to find definitions for this idea, we can summarize the narrative of model minority myth as the Harvard Law publication The Practice defines. The term model minority has often been used to refer to a minority group perceived as particularly successful, especially in a manner that contrasts with other minority groups. We can say this idea continues to live in our daily lives, especially among Asian communities with greater implication for identity and interracial solidarity. Once it made a homogeneous perception of Asian immigrants and their descendants, which we can see not only in the United States but also in other countries, it erases the diversity of Asian people at the same time that it doesn't count the struggles within those individuals. If hard work and dedication equals success, so as everybody follows this formula, then there would be no more inequalities. Or if it's something related to blood, then there are no exceptions for what we call failures. As Asian immigrants and their descendants can relate very well to the imaginary built by the model minority myth, after struggling so much to fit in, we have to think inside our own experiences and outside in the society as well, because rethinking about our privileges is something hard to do, but a must if we're trying to fight racism in its all forms.